Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Brian Thatcher, and welcome to Mercy Unbound. It's a series that aims to provide hope, an avenue for healing, and one that will help you better understand and then live the great mercy of God. With me today, I have an interesting, fascinating guest, Joseph Pearce. He's going to share with us his story. He is now a Catholic biographer and speaker. He's a devout Catholic, but he was a former leader of the National Front, a white supremacist group that wanted to ban all non-whites from England. At one point growing up, he was editor of the Bulldog, a paper whose sole purpose was to invoke racial hatred. And he aligned himself with neo-Nazi groups and the Protestant counterpart to the IRA. He went to prison twice, and now he understands that hatred is not the answer, but love. For we know that God is love. And we're going to discuss his journey from a racist revolutionary to a loving Christian. Welcome, Mr. Pearce.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, before we start, I just want to mention your book that got me fascinated in your story, Race with the Devil, Joseph Pearce, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. And we see so much hatred today. And the antithesis of hatred is love, and God is love. This book you can get at tanbooks.com, and I suggest you order it and read it. It's a fascinating story. But in it, you start out, the first part of the book is about your childhood. And you mentioned your father more heavily than your mother. That's understandable, your father figure, et cetera. But can you talk about growing up and, your father perhaps as a model for you?
Yes, one of the most difficult things about writing the book was to be honest about my relationship with my father, because I had a very good relationship with my father. He was a very loving father. He was certainly a flawed individual, as are we all. He liked the taste of beer, perhaps a bit too much, and spent too much time in the pub, and therefore wasn't always at home to help my mum with me and my brother. But when he was at home, he was very, very loving. We spent lots of quality time together. I mean, he taught me to play chess, and if you know anything about that, that takes time. And we played hundreds of games of chess together. But he taught me many good things. He loved Shakespeare, he loved literature, he loved poetry. He was an autodidact. He was self-taught. He left school at 14. So he's a great inspiration for me, but he was also very angry at what was happening in England when I was a child in the 60s and early 70s, and was a racist and very anti-Catholic. So the IRA's terrorist campaign in England sort of brought up his latent anti-Irishness, and that manifested itself in anti-Catholicism. So I was raised to be anti-Catholic, and he was very angry with the number of immigrants entering the country at that time, and that led to an overflowing and outpouring of racism. So I learned my racism at my father's knee. So it's a very, it's a sweet and sour story. I love my father dearly. I mean, he's passed on now, but I pray for him daily, and I hope he's praying for me. He was received in the Catholic Church on his 10 years before he died, and had a very holy death. I was praying the rosary with him, within an hour or two of his actually dying. So there's a happy ending there, but nonetheless, a large part of my growing up was unlearning some of the things I'd learned at my father's knee, basically.
You mentioned being raised a nominal Anglican, and there was anti-Catholic and anti-Semitic sentiment in the home. You mentioned a word I had never heard before, Fawkes Night or Bonfire Night, in the gunpowder plot of 1605. You love to read. You got that from your father, and you read all the time, and you're very well spoken. I don't know anything about the gunpowder plot of 1605. Share with us what was going on and what that Fawkes Night is.
Yeah, so one of the things I write quite a bit about is English history. I have a new book coming out in November, which is a history of Catholic England. But I've also written a lot about Shakespeare, and Shakespeare lived during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I and her successor, King James I. The gunpowder plot of 1605 happened in the early years of King James's reign. And in those days, it was illegal to be a Catholic in England, and punishable by death to be a priest, and punishable by death to harbour priests. Now, the one thing about that was that there a lot of people obviously capitulated and gave up their faith. Others just carried on resolutely living as underground Catholics. But there was a hot-headed minority who were tempted to violence. That the only way that we could get a Catholic kingdom back was basically to blow up the king and Parliament. The Parliament at this stage was largely controlled by Puritans, who were very anti-Catholic, obviously. So, unbeknownst to these hot-headed young Catholics, this plot was basically being orchestrated by the king's own spy network. So they were dupes. But the consequence was that Guy Fawkes and others, Robert Catesby, were arrested and tried for treason and burned. Now, such is the burned at the stake, and such is the anti-Catholicism of official English history, that Guy Fawkes Night became a night, November the 5th every year, when we celebrated anti-Catholicism by burning an effigy of Guy Fawkes on a bonfire with fireworks. And that, I mean, that carries on to this day. It's still, you know, it's in some sense, it's the England's 4th of July. It's the day when we all have fireworks in England. So it's a celebration, but there's dark underbelly and to anti-Catholic underbelly, which is obviously part of the English historical psyche, which I inherited as a child.
Now, the 60s, of course, was a time of confusion in the United States, and it looks like it was the same in England. There was a party that formed in the late 60s, the Nationalist Front Group, and you were just a teenager, if I believe, around that time. Tell me what that group was and how did you get involved?
Well, thanks very much, Brian, for adding 10 years to my age. I was a child in the 60s. The National Front was formed in 1967. I didn't join until 1976 when I was 15. But I was involved in the National Front from 1976 until I finally extricated myself from it in 1986. 1987 even, possibly. So I rose through its ranks, became one of its leading members, was the chairman of the Young National Front, the organization's youth movement. And it was a neo-Nazi, white supremacist organization that believed in the compulsory expulsion of all non-whites to use the language of the party, to their lands of ethnic origin.
You mentioned something in your book that really hit me. It was if maybe it was a point at that point in your life, the light went off in your head, but you said in the book, when you had separated from Nick Griffin, and you may mention him a little bit and tell us who he was, when you drifted apart, you wrote, actions need to be rooted in philosophical and theological first principles, whereas Nick was still stuck on the idea of ideology and the day-to-day political struggle. What did you mean by that, and how is that relevant to today's society with all the hatred and this group and that group and the youth looking for answers?
Yeah, I mean, there's a famous saying, of course, that ideas have consequences. And if you're only working on the level of politics, that's the level of ideology, and you're not working on the level of theological or philosophical first principles, then you find you're willing to do anything for the triumph of your political idea. That's why in the 20th century, that communism is responsible for the killing of tens of millions of civilians. Normally, the civilians of the country that the communists are actually in control of. And then the other, you know, that's international socialism, communism. And then you have national socialism, which I was closer to in those days, which again, Hitler, you know, said we were starting a 1,000-year Reich. Basically, that the German Empire was going to be greater than the Roman Empire, the greatest empire to ever lived. So does it matter if you have to kill, you know, a few million Jews or a few million dissidents, if you're talking about 1,000 years, right? This worship of the future based upon an ideology is deadly and far deadlier than any other manifestation of human evil in history. So we've seen the danger of ideology from the time of the French Revolution onwards, and indeed earlier. So for me, you have to understand that at rock bottom is the commandment, the two great commandments of Christ, to love the Lord thy God and to love thy neighbor. And if anything you're doing contradicts those commandments, it's illicit. Even if the aim is a good aim, we're not allowed to use evil means to a good end. Because if we use evil means to a good end, we become evil in the process, and the end becomes evil because of the means we're using to get to it. So the only way you can have a pure end is to have pure means. In other words, rooted in love and not rooted in hatred.
And the purity of intention too. You know, we have a saying, which I'm sure you know, the end justify the means. Well,
right.
Not really.
It doesn't. It doesn't justify the means. That the end has to, the means have to reflect the goodness of the end. So if the goodness of the end is, for instance, to love the Lord thy God and love thy neighbor, then the means to that end also has to involve loving God and loving neighbor. You can't say I'm going to hate my neighbor in order to destroy people that are destroying my neighbor. You know, if you're going to take that on, then you're destroying neighbors to help neighbors. Sorry, at this point, you've lost the plot.
Oh, yeah, and you lost your way too. And that's so important today is people really do think they're going to solve all these problems, but they're doing it in bad, terrible, immoral, unethical, and irreligious ways. But
they think that as long as the end is good, it doesn't matter what I do to achieve it. And that has been responsible for the killing of tens of millions of people, and will continue to be until we understand we have to use the means of love towards the end of love. You can't use non-loving means to a loving end. It doesn't work.
That's a good way to put that. I read your book and I think, man, you were a busy guy in your young years because you were involved with this group and that group, and you traveled in Northern Ireland and were involved with the Protestant terrorist groups, the equivalent, I guess, of the IRA. How did they all share similar ideologies with you, and what led you to go there?
Well, you know, I was a tribal anti-Catholic. So I was essentially an agnostic. So in Northern Ireland, you effectively had a civil war going on from the late 60s to the late 90s for a period of 30 years. I was involved right in the middle part of that. So my trips to Northern Ireland were from 1978 when I was 17. My last visit there was probably in 1985 when I was 24. So for a period of about 7 years, right in the middle of that civil war, I was involved. And ostensibly, it was between the Catholics and the Protestants, but it was really between the Catholic tribe and the Protestant tribe, because the Catholics were led by the Catholic terrorists were the IRA and the INLA, the Irish National Liberation Army, both of which were Marxists, pro-abortion, anti the Catholic Church in terms of what the Catholic Church actually believes. So they wore the badge of Catholicism as an ethnic tribe, but not as something they believed. And on the other side, you know, I was anti-Catholic. I wasn't Protestant because I wasn't a Christian. So I was a tribal Protestant, but an actual agnostic, and I hated Catholics. So I got myself involved. I was obviously a very angry young man, as you would have gathered already. So my attitude was the IRA is planting bombs in my country and killing people. The only response to that is to kill them. So you join the other extreme, and you get involved with the UDA, the Ulster Defence Association, and the UVF, the Ulster Volunteer Force, who are two terrorist organisations that were opposing the IRA. So that's what I became involved in Northern Ireland. And I was also a member of a secret society called the Orange Order, which is an anti-Catholic secret society, only exists to hate the Catholic Church. So I was a member of that. But again, you know, I wasn't a Protestant, I was an agnostic. I was a tribal Protestant and a tribal anti-Catholic, but theologically, I don't care.
What was it like to travel back and forth back then? Could you just easily get into Northern Ireland, or were they keeping an eye on you because of, you know, your history?
Yeah, obviously it wasn't quite as easy to track people in the days before the internet and cell phones and the what we might call the big brother Orwellian state in which we find ourselves now. But I do know for a fact that I was being followed and photographed. I know at various times my phone was bugged. So I could bore you with the evidence for that. You know, a friend of mine who was a policeman was fired because he was photographed with me in a pub. I you know, I was being monitored, and you know, you were careful. You wouldn't say anything on the phone that you didn't want people to know. You just say, "No, let's go and meet somewhere," and then you talk about it there. But yeah, they were dangerous times. The obviously once or twice over there, I found myself in a dangerous situation, which, by the grace of God, didn't end up being worse. I mean, there were several times in my youth that I could easily have been killed, and you know, and it's only by the grace of God that I wasn't, and that I was around to convert. So I mean, this is all a mystery to me as to why I was spared during those angry years, and was received into the church and could move forward.
You know, when I think of this orange order, I think it was Fulton Sheen years ago made a comment to the effect, I'm paraphrasing, but there are millions of people who hate the Catholic Church for what they think it stands for, but there's only a few that hate it for what it really stands for. You know, so much misunderstanding, and you hear the same things played over and over again, you know, and it's just not true. But
that's exactly the case, is that all of the things that the Orange Order said that the Catholic Church believed in wasn't what the Catholic Church believed in. There were misperceptions and prejudices. Chesterton said, it's basically saying the same sort of thing as Fulton Sheen, that as soon as people stop pulling against the church, they feel drawn towards it, which is essentially saying exactly the same thing, because you have to put up a resistance based upon prejudice. And as soon as you remove that resistance, remove that prejudice, you see what the Catholic Church actually is and not what you think it is, then you get pulled towards it.
Now, you went to prison twice, but the first time they got you for inciting hatred through your printing, and you felt you really a political prisoner. So at that first trip to the prison, your heart wasn't ready to hear much, was it?
No, and I went to prison both times for the same crime, editing a magazine called Bulldog, and the crime was publishing material likely to incite racial hatred. But my first sentence, I was sentenced to 6 months in prison when I was 20 years old. I did consider myself to be a political prisoner, a political soldier. I used the prison sentence to get myself in shape physically, using my cell and my bed as a sort of gym, and came out more determined than ever to be an extremist in the political struggle. But by the time the second prison sentence came around 5 years later, it's much more difficult, because I was beginning of a 12-month sentence, thinking, I don't even believe this stuff. You know, I've been living a lie for the last year or so. I don't even believe this stuff, and now I'm in prison for 12 months for it. So I didn't have that resolution, because that had been undermined by my reading largely of Catholic authors. And so I was sort of halfway between sort of Christianity and these bad ideas. But I talk about being an arm wrestle going on in my mind and my heart, and basically the Christ was winning. And so that was why at the time, at the beginning of that second prison sentence, I thought, this is just crazy. I'm actually now going to serve a 12-month prison sentence for something I don't even believe in.
Now, where were your mom and dad in all this? Did they support you wholeheartedly? Or they say, you know, you might want to rethink this or back off a little bit? Or when you were going through the first prison particularly, where were they?
Well, I mean, my parents, particularly my father, but both my parents supported my political position. So it wasn't as if I was being discouraged in terms of ideas, but they were loving parents, and they could see that the lifestyle I'd chosen was dangerous. And my involvement in Northern Ireland was potentially deadly. They could see that, you know, I was putting myself on the front line, and as parents, they were concerned for me. And I certainly, once I was sent to prison, I mean, they were obviously mortified that to see me suffering. I mean, as any loving parent would be, but it wasn't because they disagreed with what I stood for. It was because they were parents.
Now, Pope John Paul II visited the British Isles. How old were you then, and where were you at in your journey then?
I think he came to the UK in 1980, if I remember correctly. I was 19, so I was very anti-Catholic. But you know what, and I was opposed to the Pope's visit. I actually, the Orange Order organised demonstrations. No Pope here. We got rid of the Pope 500 years ago, and we didn't want him back. That's 450 years ago. Then we don't want him back. So I was very much opposed to his visit, and yet at the same time I was very anti-communist. And I couldn't help but admire St. John Paul II's role in the Solidarity movement in Poland, and his role in bringing down the Soviet empire. So I was conflicted, and this is the whole point: is that the more you actually get in contact with the real Catholicism, rather than your ideas of it, the more you find yourself conflicted and your prejudice is being undermined. And that's a perfect example. In theory, I hated the Pope. In practice, I admired this particular Pope.
Was your conversion in large part then due to, you say your father kind of incited or taught you racism, but he also was an avid reader, and your reading was part of the big reason why you melted your heart, wasn't it? So he was working at both ends.
Yeah, I mean, my father taught me. My father left school at 14 because of World War II, and that was the end of his formal education. But then he was an autodidact. He was bibliophilically self-taught. He loved books, loved reading, and I inherited that from him. And I thank God for that, because that I was interested in politics. I wasn't interested in religion, but someone said to me, "Have you looked at the political and economic ideas of G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc?" And I hadn't even heard of them. But I said, well, no, but this person was a person whose views I respected. So I started reading Chesterton and Belloc. And at first, of course, I loved their politics, I loved their economics, not knowing it was basically Catholic social teaching at the time. Because when I came to realize that, I began to realize that all of my deep political ideas in terms of economics and politics come from the teaching of the church. So that was something else. But I found with Chesterton that even though I disagreed with his religion and his religious stuff, that I couldn't help liking him. You sort of, C.S. Lewis said, when he first read Chesterton, he was an atheist. Lewis was an atheist when he first read Chesterton during World War I, when he was in the army, when Lewis was in the army. And he said, it's a bit like falling in love, that you love this person and you want to spend time with them, even if you don't agree with them. And Lewis said that Chesterton has more common sense than all the moderns put together, except, of course, his Christianity. And of course, then Lewis comes to see that the wisdom of Chesterton comes from his Christianity. Same thing with me, that I came to realize the reason I liked Chesterton was because he was a Christian. The reason that the other key thing was, I grew up, as many people do, thinking you have to choose between being religious or being rational. Right? You can either be rational or religious. You can't be both, right? You can be religious and be irrational but happy, or you can be rational and therefore irreligious and perhaps unhappy. But you can't do the both, because they don't go together. And it was Chesterton, and of course he was a disciple of St. Thomas Aquinas, that it was Chesterton that taught me that fides et ratio, that faith and reason were an indissoluble marriage. They were bound together and they couldn't be separated. And of course, as soon as you realize you haven't got to choose between being rational and being religious, in actual fact, to be one is to be the other, then you're on that path to conversion.
At what point did you say, okay, I'm going to join the church? And did your parents support you in all this, in your journey? How did that play out?
Yeah, well, they weren't ready certainly to follow me over the threshold into the church, but they were relieved, because I think they'd seen the destructive aspects of my political views and the physical dangers of my physical views, and they thought well, finding religion, finding Christ would keep me out of trouble. So I think on a purely pragmatic level, they were pleased. They certainly traveled up to Norwich in England and were present on the day I was received into the church at the I think they were happy with the move. My father eventually, not my mother, sadly, but my father was received into the church himself about 6 or 7 years after me, and spent the last 10 years of his life as a Catholic also.
Did he just call you one day and say, "This is what I'm doing," or how did his conversion?
Well, we had lots of heated discussions, both before and after my reception into the church, and we always believed in reason, and we always believed we were happy to argue. G.K. Chesterton said about his relationship with his brother, we were always arguing, but we never quarreled. And that was very much my relationship with my father. We were always arguing, but we never quarreled. And bit by bit, I think probably two things happened. One, I think he did come to see the reason, the ratio behind Catholicism. That if Christianity is true, then that there's only one church, and it's the Catholic Church. He came to see that. And also, I think he saw that it was having a very positive impact upon my own life. And those two things together perhaps were what led him to cross the threshold himself when he was about 60 years old, 65 years old.
Were you able to be there when that happened?
When he was, I was there when he was received into the church. You bet, yeah. Obviously, a very joyous day. He was by this stage he was very sick with emphysema, so he was housebound. So he didn't often get to mass because he couldn't leave the house. But obviously, he received the sacrament when it was brought to him by Eucharistic ministers or what have you. So it obviously gave him that peace and resolution that what we all need, and he needed it as much as anybody else.
It's kind of like right out of the scripture, it's only the peace that the Lord can give. And
and I sometimes think that I see my conversion as miraculous. But I think in some ways, perhaps my father's was even more miraculous than mine. He was, say, very anti-Catholic and had lived that anti-Catholic and racist experience much longer than I had. I was received in the church when I was 28. My father was received in the church when he was 65. And they say that, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. I do think it's harder to teach an old dog new tricks. So I do think it was a great and miraculous blessing that my father came to embrace Christ and his church.
It really is a wonderful story. Now, can you go back to England, or how does that work if you want to get into England? Are you able to get in with a criminal record, or?
Well, in England, there's I can't remember what the law is called now, but basically, if you stay out of trouble, I think it's either 5 or 10 years, and then as far as the system's concerned, you're clean. So that's not an issue at all. COVID's an issue. Haven't been able to get back to England since before COVID began. I guess things are just so tricky at the moment. But no, I there's no problem. I would still feel a little bit. Haven't been back to Northern Ireland since my conversion, and I would go back now. But I think I probably wouldn't let many people know where I was going to be or when, because now I've got both sides. Right, because there might be people on the IRA side that have a grudge to bear because of my involvement, and there might be people on the Protestant side that consider me a traitor for.
Right.
So I'd be a little bit careful if I were to go back to the north of Ireland. Although what's very interesting now is I've had several dealings with former IRA men and former IRA prisoners who have also, they've abandoned their Marxism and have embraced the Catholic faith. And we are now comrades where we were deadly enemies. And that itself, I think, is a glorious example of the healing that we get through Christ.
Wow, that's awesome. Mr. Pearce, any closing thoughts you'd like to talk to the people today who are maybe in the attitudes that you had many years ago, or what would you like to tell the people?
Well, I think the key thing is that there are obviously lots of things that are wrong with the world, as there's lots that we could justifiably feel angry about. But I sometimes think the one place we shouldn't follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ is in turning over the tables of the temple, because he can have righteous anger because he is love. But when we have anger, even if it's about something which is really unjust, our anger very quickly can turn to hatred. And if we find that we are lacking charity towards our neighbours, we're on the wrong side. Even if what we're saying is the right thing, we're still on the wrong side, because we're on the side of those who hate, and not the side of those who love. So by all means, fight the political cause. By all means, fight for the good, the true, and the beautiful in society. But if you can't do it with love in your heart, step away, because it's better to not fight and remain on the side of the angels than to get involved in that fray and find yourself fighting the devil because you're as full of hatred as the people you're fighting against.
Right. Well, I just want to encourage the viewers and listeners to get this book, Race with the Devil by Joseph Pearce, My Journey from Racial Hatred to Rational Love. And you're out now spreading light to a world that's full of darkness, and love can wipe out hatred, and that's what you're trying to do. And I encourage you to keep up the great work. I thank you for joining us today on Mercy Unbound. People, you can watch the video, listen to the podcast, drbrianthatcher.com, and do get this book. And I'm sure Mr. Pearce would love to speak at any conference or church gathering, because he's spreading God's work, and he is amplifying God's love to a hurting world. So behind me, we see the merciful Savior, the image of the divine mercy, and his rays has touched Mr. Pearce's heart and melted it, and he's a changed man. So thank you again, Mr. Pearce, for joining us on Mercy Unbound, and everyone have a blessed day. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel for the video portion. The podcast can be heard at anchor.fm/drbrian, Bryan Thatcher, Thatcher, and on all the major podcast forums. I would love to speak at your church or conference, and please consider supporting our efforts to spread the truth to a hurting world. Thank you again. And for more information, go to the website at drbrianthatcher.com.